Good evening. Thank you for the fascinating talk and the discussion. I just want to challenge you on the fact that we don't have a model for administering a drug to a population. What about cigarettes in the past or alcohol currently? The way we're promoting these substances among the general population could be seen as a model for administering these drugs for large groups of people. The way they're seen as a sociable tool, how it helps people interact in a more relaxed environment, how it's promoted as, how cigarettes were promoted as something cool and masculine in the past. So I think we do have models for
That's
widespread.
interesting, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, but there's still the issue of, I'm really struck by the fact that and especially at this moment where our president is, you've probably heard, Donald Trump, that two of the biggest problems we face as a civilization, I would say, are the environmental crisis, which flows from a disconnection with nature, and tribalism, which flows from a objectification. Both are about objectifying the other, actually. They're actually remarkably similar. And psychedelics addresses both of those formations in an interesting way. You've done some research that suggests that it's, there's anti-authoritarian tendencies, and also that nature-relatedness is something you've measured. That that before and after a psilocybin trip, I guess it was, people feel more a part of nature and less distant from it. So I think they have something to offer at the societal level, but how do you get there? Do you promote it to lots of people? How many people do you have to trip before you've changed the tenor of the society? Or is it getting the right people to trip? And we can think of one example.
At least.
But he'd have to want to do it. And I think it would cost him his power, actually, to do it. So it's a very hard question. I do see a social relevance to the work, but how you translate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love it to be translated through science, of course, because it's grounding. But Lindsay, you had a question over there. Yeah, just over here, please.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
So it was something you said earlier about. And you and Robin kind of disagreed on this. You said that you can't do science while you're tripping. And Robin said, well...
I can't.
We stay sober.
You have to. And I wondered, of course we can unpack what we mean by science. And I've been reading at the moment about Humphrey Davy, whose archives are actually here at the Royal Institution. And Humphrey Davy was a chemist and also something of a philosopher as well. And so he took opium and cannabis and also nitrous oxide, I think. And he was, constantly doing science, well, in the broad sense of the word, while he was tripping. And so that's something that I'm very interested in. I wondered, and in the last chapter of your book, you move away from the biomedical model and you talk more about, I guess, kind of what these things can do for intellectual insights as well. And so I wondered whether you could say a bit about that and whether, I guess, kind of modes of use, possible protocols, things like that for intellectual insights.
Yeah. There's a very rich history of scientists taking the drugs they're studying. And in fact, if you go back to the 50s, it was considered the ethical thing to do. Before you gave it to somebody else, you had to use it yourself. And many breakthroughs did happen as a result of, Humphrey Osmond having experiences and his colleagues and Sidney Cohen, the psychiatrist in LA, and that we fundamentally misunderstood the experience before they had tried it. In other words, we tended to think that these drugs induced something like a psychosis. And it wasn't until these scientists tried it and they realized, it doesn't feel like psychosis. It's something else. But I only meant the physical nature of conducting an experiment while tripping. I do think that there is a place for scientists to have this experience. And I also think it is science to have an experience and write about it. It's data. It's very important data. And is one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is make my own small contribution to the science by trying to describe the experiences as precisely, as scrupulously as I can. So I totally take your point. The betterment of well people is a phrase that one of the researchers in America uses to describe what's the value of these things for other people who don't have mental illness, and how do we make it available to them? I think this is a hard question. I think right now we're going down a medical path, seeking approval from regulators so that could be a prescription medicine. But I do think that the rest of us stand to gain. Not everyone, but we do stand to gain. That we're all trapped in habits of thought and behavior that we would like to get out of, especially as we get older. And that the models, going back to the Bayesian brain, we have so many models and so little experience. That these models blind us to the present and to experience, and that was one of the things I got jealous of when I talked to people who had these experiences, that, wow, I think you used this expression in an interview, to shake the snow globe of your mental life every now and then seems like a worthwhile thing to do. So how do we make it available to those people? Can we imagine a day where there'll be a mental health club that you could go, say, and there would be a doctor in charge who would screen you, and that's very important, and perhaps prescribe it to you. I mean, many people go to psychotherapists who aren't mentally ill. They're unhappy, they have problems, so, I think that there will be ways for people to access it. But I haven't thought through exactly what that would mean. I don't think anyone really has yet.
I think you touched on a possibility, though, and just to say it explicitly in terms of the Bayesian brain model, we didn't really do that, but the idea is that there's a relaxation, let's say, or even a collapse of beliefs and assumptions, and you can think of that as occurring very dramatically with ego dissolution, of course. And you can imagine how that could be helpful therapeutically when you have pathological beliefs or assumptions, like that you're worthless, or that life isn't worth living and such like.
Yeah, if you're trapped in stories like that, and many people do get trapped in stories about who they are, to break out of that and acquire another perspective is so empowering. And then there's the fact, which we didn't talk about, that the sturdiness of the insights that people have on psychedelics, what William James called the noetic quality, that they have an amazing authority for people. And that, so a smoker who there was a pilot study of smoking cessation, and I would ask people, why would a psilocybin trip allow you to stop smoking? And they would say things like, well, I realized that my breath is precious, and it's really stupid to kill yourself with cigarettes. This isn't that profound. I mean, I'm sure they've thought of it before. But for some reason, it's sticky. It has this power, and that power lasts in such a way that allows people to actually change behavior.
Yeah, the clarity is quite incredible, and something we've observed a lot in our studies, where it's really a long way from being in the company. So it feels of someone who's in a psychotic episode. It feels like you're in the company of someone who's proundly wise, often actually, and is having these,
clear.
The clarity is incredible. Okay, sure. Let's take you, and then the person next to you. This lady down here, please.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, Michael, about your reaction to the press's reaction to your book. There's been a couple of, I would say, very oversimplified headlines around your book and some sound bites, and I just wanted to know...
What would be an example?
Take acid, not too much.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, that's a play on a phrase I'm well known for, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And I saw this coming from a mile away. That I used to be a magazine editor, so I wrote headlines, and people take liberties with headlines, and hopefully people don't take them too seriously. But I am alarmed that some people read the book as having this normative message that everyone should do this. And I'm surprised that people can't read a book for a vicarious experience, that so many people who read this book feel they have to now take LSD. And it certainly wasn't my intent. I was giving a talk at Google in Seattle, and this woman stands up. She's in her 30s, and she's an engineer or something, and she said, when I read Omnivore's Dilemma, I had to learn how to butcher a pig, and I did. I didn't think when I came to work today that I'd now have to take LSD. And I was like telling her, no, you don't have to take LSD. And it might not be right for you. So I am, I'm very clear in the book that there are risks. And I need to emphasize that. They're not so much physiological risks. The drugs are not that toxic to the body. They're probably more toxic drugs in your medicine cabinet that you bought without prescription, that have a lethal dose, for example. And they're non-addictive. But there are psychological risks. There are real psychological risks. People do get into trouble. I should say, however, that in the trials, I estimated in the book, with Matt Johnson's help, that 1,000 people, as of a couple months ago, had been dosed with psilocybin in this modern era of research. And there has not been one serious adverse event. So if you're screened properly, if you're guided by a competent person, the risks are quite low. But that's not always how people use these drugs. And they do stupid things. People walk out into traffic and they fall out of buildings. And I mean, you're debilitated. People take them in the craziest of settings. And so I urge caution for people who want to explore this path. And encourage you to find a guide.
That's good. Sure.
Thank you. So there seems to be some evidence that psychedelics, if that's the right expression, change what you think if you take them. So you get hallucinations, different images in your brain, things like that. But what evidence is there that they change the structure of your brain, perhaps permanently, and consequently change how you think permanently, and consequently permanently change how people behave?
Robin, you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, we are going to address it in one of our next studies. And it has to be said that knowledge of the longer-term effects on brain anatomy aren't particularly well established. There's one study, and there's a bit of a relationship between both an increase and a decrease in grey matter density, the bits of the brain that does the computation, terrible description, but sort of functionally important parts, both an increase and a decrease, and relationships there with some trait changes, including one of the trait changes that seems to dominate how people are affected by psychedelics, which is an increase in trait openness. It's a different...
have you seen that, or is that based on the Hopkins work?
That's Busso et al. is the title of that paper. That's Jordi Reba's people with ayahuasca. So more ayahuasca use and these changes and some relationship with, I think the trait they call transcendence, but you can translate it as openness. And so those questions of those lasting changes in the way people think and sort of are or see the world, it has to be said, and I'm glad Michael's introed this with a cautionary note, because otherwise people can just take it and run with it, and they shouldn't. But if you look at population studies, the changes appear to be positive. That's one of the odd things about psychedelics, is that they're drugs apart from other drugs, it seems. So people who've taken them in the past actually have better mental health outcomes. That's really anomalous,
And lower suicide rates.
So these are the lasting changes. So,
but that's not necessarily cause and effect. That's a correlation.
It's a correlation, but yeah.
But I mean, you could interpret that as
it's a large sample.
People who aren't. Yeah, it is. It's hundreds of thousands of people. Yeah, it's true. But on the other hand, maybe psychologically sturdier people are more likely to take psychedelics. I don't know.
Possibly. Yeah. Another question, please. Up here. Up.
Oh, way up there. Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Up in the heavens.
My question, rather, I'd like to pose a question that's a bit more. I'm sorry, Robin. Is it hard?
It's all right. It's for Michael.
Okay. It's about what it means to keep this under a scientific lens, because both of you, to differing degrees, I think, are quite keen to foreground this as a scientific investigation that you're undertaking. And I suppose what I'm curious about is what you think about what it means to take seriously the world as it reveals itself in the psychedelic experience and the potentially healing effects thereof. So as a psychologist, I can see how the revelations about the self and about one's memories can be healing in a way that's scientifically untroubling. We can view the revelations about ourselves as, you know, just simply manifestations that are produced through different frame of neural activity without being overly troubled by that. But there was a question about, you know, how this could be socially healing. So sort of whether that comes from a sense of transcendence of the self and, you know, how we take that seriously. I have to think of how I can put this. I think, for example, like Robin, when you commented on, you know, like how if we call this God, that has a psychic reality and therefore in that sense is real. I'm not sure if that quite washes if you really want to call it God that you experience in a psychedelic.
Powerful archetype.
Powerful archetype, well, exactly, but I mean, I think, is that what's, for some people that may be transformative, but on the other hand, if it comes from a genuine belief that this is an experience of something transcendent, and that is what produces a sense of change within the self and can be socially transformative. How can we embrace that in a way that still, well, is it possible to truly embrace that within a sort of materialist scientific perspective? And if so, how?
That's really a hard question. I'm not sure. You know, I'm a little more, I mean, I tend to have a very naturalistic understanding of this, although I have to say my confidence was somewhat shaken in materialistic understandings of things because of the profound experience. I came at it as a philosophical materialist, and I think I ended that way. But as I said, I do think ego consciousness, if we can call it that, can be a very destructive force, and that the powerful experiences of love that is very common on these journeys, which is very hard to talk about without sounding totally banal and like a Hallmark card. Nevertheless is real. And there's a riff in the book where I talk about this, and that just because something is familiar to us, and you know, we all know love is important, but we forget every day how important love is, and that it is the most important thing in the world. And that to be reminded of that is, with the authority of the psychedelic experience, is, I think, a very healing thing. But that I totally understand that naturalistically. Our brains are tuned for novelty, right? I mean, detecting novelty is much more important than detecting the familiar, right? Because threats and you know, all the reasons that we want to pick up changes in our environment and in our lives, so that there's this whole set of familiar things that get ignored. And one of the things psychedelics do is take even the familiar out and kind of scrub it, and it shines again. And that, I think, has great utility, just as a reminder. I mean, there's a throwaway line in the book that psychedelics may be wasted on the young. And, you know, the older we get, the more stuck in various patterns and mental algorithms. So I think as a matter of psychotherapy, this can take us really in the right direction. I don't know if that quite answers your question. But the religious point, I do think it's unfair to people who have faith to say it's just an archetype. There are, you know, in the same way Carlo Rovelli ended up in his place, people can end up in a very different place, a spiritual place. And I'm not prepared to say that they're, you know, that one is better than the other.
I mean,
or truer than the other.
Yeah, in defense of the just, I wouldn't use a just, a bit like the brain, you know, that the experiences of the brain and has such a close relationship. There's no just, you know, it's incredible that this is true. And
there's no just, you're right.
The unconscious mind is so vast, and archetypes are so strong in our psyche.
And you know, one of the big takeaways for me was just that. It's the last line of the book, that the world is so much more alive, and the mind is so much vaster than I ever understood. And for me, there was, it sounds like a kind of animism, actually, but to me, the subjectivity of other beings, including plants, became very vivid to me. And I do believe they have a subjectivity, not in the sense of, you know, what it's like to be a rose, but in the sense of having a point of view and a set of interests, that they're, you know, an agency. And that was an intellectual conceit that after one of my psilocybin experiences became a very strongly felt belief. So.
Another question. Where should we go? Middle at the back. Have we got a mic for the toughest place to get to?
There he is.
Thank you. Yeah, I did pick a great spot. But I promise my question will be short, trivial, and superficial. Michael, you said at the beginning of your presentation, rightly so, that UK is so much more atheistic and different to the States in that respect. Yet it is the States and, you know, Donald Trump's America that has largely legalized recreational medical marijuana. And it is possible that LSD through microdosing and mushrooms will be next. So a question to both of you is like, how do you foresee the future of access to these substances? Because we're definitely seeing some sort of a breakthrough in terms of research. Yet in this country, in a sort of liberal atheist UK, you can't buy laughing gas, let alone marijuana or LSD, which is, you know, an odd thing to square if you think about it. So in equal measure to Robin and Michael, how do you foresee the future of access and legalization of these substances so that we can all try them on our own without going on the dark net?
So, you know, there is the model of cannabis in America. And forgive me for not being up on the status of what's going on with medical marijuana and things like that. But in America...
not much here.
Not much?
No.
Yeah. So there was a lot of work beginning in the 90s to legalize medical marijuana, state by state. It was done by vote. Curiously, this happened with less science than we now have about psilocybin. Most of the science was anecdotal, that it helped people with wasting syndrome who had AIDS, that it helped epileptics, but there were no studies. And the reason for that is the government of the United States, and I don't know if this is true here, actually makes it harder to study cannabis than psilocybin or LSD, which is kind of remarkable. You have to use government marijuana, which is horrible, apparently. And it's grown on one farm in Mississippi according to 1962 standards. And as you know, there's been a lot of progress in marijuana horticulture since then. But the idea was that medical marijuana would kind of change the image of marijuana from Cheech and Chong, and, you know, and then it would be taken seriously, and then it would become approved. And that strategy, which was laid out by the drug policy reformers, worked. And now we're seeing state after state marijuana, including my state, California, legalized. I don't think psilocybin is on that path. The path it's on is a much more conventional path of drug approval by the FDA or the EMA, European Medicines Agency. And the researchers are going through there's a path laid out of, pilot study, phase 2, phase 3, in consultation with regulators. And that's happening. And I think that path, rather than, say, putting psilocybin on a ballot measure, which I don't think would work because not enough people have heard of it. And if you put LSD on a ballot measure, it would be defeated soundly. I mean, the public's impression of LSD is still, a drug that makes you crazy, not a drug that can possibly make you more sane. And that's a large gap to cross in terms of public opinion. So I think that what will happen is that eventually, if these larger trials work out, and Robin's about to launch one on depression, and actually testing it against the standard of care, an SSRI antidepressant, and see which is actually better, it's that story that will change the public narrative about these drugs. So I don't know that the cannabis model is right, even if it were possible. I do think that these are more, that there are higher psychological risks here involved, and that you need to regulate the use of these drugs, I believe. And now prohibition, ironically, makes it impossible to regulate anything. And that's the advantage of legalization, is that you can set rules. Who's licensed to administer it? Do you need a guide? All these kind of things. So I haven't, I don't have a plan for how to do it, but I think the path we're on is the conventional drug approval. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would to a large extent. It's that psychedelics are a different drug, and so the model that's been followed with cannabis in terms of medicalization and now full legalization that seems to be happening in certain countries. I don't think we need to be very careful about that kind of step with psychedelics, because as you say, the psychological risks are different. You shouldn't be walking down a high street on a large dose of magic mushrooms. And so, even though plenty of people do that in Amsterdam and elsewhere, but and so I'd like. But it is this kind of not catch-22, but a sort of tricky dilemma, because the other way that people take psychedelics is, as I just said, to take them, recklessly, irresponsibly, and get them off the dark web and such like. So, that's not addressing harm reduction very well. But then you also, don't want to be too hasty in terms of integrating it into society, and then people, not hearing the right cautionary messages, and so eventually, it would make sense, I think, to have a system where people can have controlled experiences, and there's screening, and there's careful therapeutic support, even though people are, well. But I just, you don't want to rush that, but also the situation now where they're illegal and you can get them and take them wrongly isn't ideal either. So, part of what can help address this matter is education. The likes of Michael's book that'll give you a very comprehensive account of these compounds, and will address safety matters so well. Is so important.
And there are books available that, if you are going to proceed without a guide, can be very helpful. There's one called the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, which actually sums up a lot of the knowledge of guiding, by James Fadiman, that I would recommend. I've also put a lot of resources on my website, michaelpollan.com, where you can find lots of information about getting involved and other things to read, because a lot of people have been asking me, can I refer them to a guide? And of course I can't, without creating enormous risk for everybody involved. We have to still remember these are Schedule I substances, and they are illegal.
Yeah. Let's take one last question. Hi. Right down the bottom, if there's a mic close.
Just a follow-up from the previous question, actually. First of all, I'd like to think that tomorrow morning mushrooms will be served at breakfast before the meeting in Singapore. That would be the ideal situation. A very scary meeting as it
I'll have
is.
the mushroom omelet, yes.
But on a serious note, actually a follow-up, how would you then avoid, if they were legalized, a situation like Oxycontin, that we were told, obviously, by Purdue that it was fine to use it as much as you could? That's my only concern. How do you do that if they were legalized?
I think that's always an issue. I think, look at how so many other drugs are marketed to us and oversold. And look at all, in America, you don't have it here, but we have drug advertising, prescription drug advertising on television for, serious psychoactive drugs and others. And they're pushed. And I think that's a concern. I think that when they're legal, for pharmaceutical use, you'll have, I'm sure, overselling of what they are. And it's an argument for better regulation than we have, but it's definitely a problem. Let's take one more question, though. That's kind of a downer to end on.
Yeah. You talk about opiates, how they stayed, we were able to bracket them in such a way where they could stay within medicine and be used in a particular way. And psychedelic, they didn't achieve that in the 60s. And that was curious that that they didn't, and it does lead you to ask, why, and is it, this change in outlook that's so profound that you don't get with these other compounds. Right, another question, and we'll take it from you over there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been great to listen to you both. I'm very grateful to be here for this. So you've been talking about healing and making sure that we need to get it right in terms of how these drugs or medicines are going to be used going forward. You talk about regulation, safety. I'd just be interested to hear either of you talk about how these medicines have been used historically through ancient traditions, and things like ayahuasca and mushrooms were taken around fires, not in labs. They use shamans, not guides wearing lab coats. So I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts, feelings, views on the role that tradition has going forward.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a good question to end on, actually. When these drugs burst upon the West in the 50s, really, they came by themselves. The molecules showed up. The traditions that molecules like this had been part of did not come with it. And I think that was part of what got us into trouble, because if you look at the history of how these drugs have been used, it was always with a very carefully designed container. There must have been a recognition how powerful they were. And so you always used them, there was always an elder. You seldom would ever use these things. The shamans might use them alone, but ordinary people would not use them alone. There was always a guide, an elder. There was always a ceremony or ritual surrounding it. So, and in ancient Greece, where there was an annual ritual called the Eleusinian Mysteries, where it appears that a psychedelic was used. We don't know what it was, but there was a potion that everybody, and there were thousands of people. There's a temple to this that still stands in Greece, and everyone except the slaves in Greek society would partake of this potion as part of this ritual, and they would, as they described it, go to the underworld or visit the beyond. And but there were real restrictions. That was the only day you were allowed to use this, and it was a capital crime if you used it outside of the ceremony. So one of the lessons of traditional use is this sort of finding the container, and that's what we're doing now, in a way, is trying to invent a container that's appropriate to our society. To the extent we have shamans, they're doctors, and we give them that sort of authority that other people might give to shamans. But I think that would be a little limiting if the hospital suite is the only setting we can imagine this, because there is something to be said about having a group experience outside. I mean, as people are having with ayahuasca. But I think it's one of the great cultural projects. We have the molecules. We know what they do. We're starting to learn what they do, thanks to Robin's work and others. So how do we incorporate them in our society? How do we design that beautiful container that will help us control this powerful force and let us reap all the benefits of it? It's a great question.
Yeah. I mean, I think we should be conscious that, it's the West that's abused these compounds, not the ancient traditions. And so there's a lot that we could look to in terms of a long, lineage of wisdom in terms of how to use these compounds. There is the magical component, but about magic, functionally, it's a very effective tool. That doesn't mean that you have to surrender afterwards to notions of the supernatural, but maybe during the experience, a case can be made because it could enhance, the effect of the treatment. So, in a pragmatic way, surrendering disbelief can be functionally, therapeutically useful during the experience. I think there's a lot, use of music, the group context. It's the West that doesn't really know how to use these compounds right yet. And so with humility, we'll test these components, and that's what we can bring, is a method. Science isn't a belief system, it's a method of testing. And so that's...
I was kind of jesting, but I was asking, can you teach a pharmaceutical company ceremony, for example?
Well, it's a challenge, but scientifically you can test the influence of context, and you could demonstrate that it's a crucial component, that if you neglect, you'll be delivering a therapy that is depleted of its potential benefit, and maybe you increase the risk of harm. And so we can test that. So in a way, yes.
Yeah, and we are testing. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind too is that it isn't just the molecule. It's the guide, it's the therapist, it's the setting, it's the music. It's a package, and there is potential to design that well, and people are working on it. And in fact, there is a pharmaceutical company, a new pharmaceutical company, that's trying very hard to divine what that would be and test it. So I wouldn't despair of that. I think it's really important who gets involved in that process, and that they approach it with humility and respect and some sense of what, as Robin says, the wisdom of cultures who have much longer experience of these chemicals than we do. So thank you all very much for your excellent questions and your close attention. And I'll be outside signing books if you have further questions. But anyway, and thank you very much, Robin.
Thank you, Michael.